Hi, I'm Stephen von Kugelgen, 2020 Arnold O. Beckman postdoctoral fellow. And today I want to tell you about my work on molecular systems for quantum information science beyond the single qubit. Quantum information science is a paradigm that is leveraging our burgeoning control over the quantum properties of light and matter to create new solutions to challenging problems, such as simulating complex quantum phenomena using quantum objects, or using delicate quantum states to sense and measure physical properties with unmatched precision and sensitivity. And underpinning all of the transformative technologies in this complicated space is the core unit of quantum information, the quantum bit or qubit. And in contrast to a classical binary bit, which can exist only in its one state or its zero state, a qubit or quantum bit can exist in its one state or its zero state or in any arbitrary superposition of those two states. Now, this alone is a really powerful way to encode information. But the most potent applications of quantum information science arise from integrating multiple quantum bits into complex solutions. For example, building up a quantum computer that uses quantum bits as quantum memories and elements of quantum logic circuits, or building up quantum sensors using entangled states distributed across multiple sensing elements that can sense physical properties better than the classical limit would dictate. And in all of these multi-qubit systems, two key properties need to be managed. We have to be able to manipulate each of these quantum elements independently, and we need to control the way in which these quantum elements interact with each other. And for this reason, building electron spin qubits, especially transition metal complexes, into molecular systems is a really attractive platform for creating qubits and understanding their properties. These electron spin qubits, in the presence of a magnetic field, have their m sub s sublevels split by the Zeeman effect. And the magnitude of this Zeeman effect is proportional to the electron G factor and dictates the microwave frequency that we can use to address this quantum two-level system. Transition metal complexes have widely tunable G factors, which allows us to create systems where each qubit has a unique G factor, meaning under the same applied magnetic field, we can control each of them with a unique control frequency. We call this spectral addressability because we are controlling each of these qubits with a different part of the microwave spectrum. Now, coordination chemistry and inorganic chemistry principles can tell us how to do this. And one of the simplest ways is to leverage the fact that spin-orbit coupling is what creates the differences in G factor from the free electron value of approximately 2. If we use elements with different electron configurations from the ends of our transition series, such as this D1 titanium-3 titanosyl benzoate, or a D9 copper-2 tetraphenyl porphyrin, we can leverage the fact that these less than half filled and more than half filled sublevels lead to opposite spin-orbit coupling shifts to the G factor, meaning that we get a copper center with a G of greater than 2 and a titanium center with a G of less than 2, achieving this spectral addressability. But beyond the control of individual qubits, building these into molecules from the bottom up allows us to control the way that they interact with one another. And so integrating an oligophenylene-ethynylene spacer allows us to control the distance and chemical nature of the linkage between these two qubits from 11.6 up to 25.2 angstroms. And as we tune the distance and chemical linkage between them, we also expect to tune their magnetic interactions with one another. And the way that we can most sensitively probe this is with electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopy, or EPR. And continuous wave EPR, shown here, clearly shows that the copper features, which show up at lower fields or higher microwave frequencies, are well separated from the titanium features, which show up at higher magnetic fields or lower microwave frequencies. Moreover, we can actually see the signatures of the qubit-qubit interactions between them in the splittings and line widths of the spectra. And we can fit these continuous wave EPR spectra with this Hamiltonian to extract quantitative information about the way these qubits interact. So we can fit it to this Hamiltonian that contains the electron Zeeman terms for copper and titanium, the electron nuclear hyperfine terms for copper and titanium, reflecting the interaction with nuclei around the metal center, and this interaction matrix J, which due to the structure and design of our system is actually simplified into this diagonal matrix containing J, which represents the through bond interaction, and D, representing the through space interactions. And what we can see is that the magnitude of these interactions decrease dramatically, as we expect, as we space these apart. But also importantly, we only really have a noticeable amount of exchange coupling through bonds for the shortest distance, and it is completely negligible beyond that. And so now we have this system of 2 qubits where we can tune the nature and the magnitude of their interactions. And we can ask fundamental structure property relational questions, such as how does the presence of a second qubit affect the first? We can imagine this happening in 2 ways. Either the second qubit could impede our quantum control over the first. That is, it might hinder our ability to write information into that superposition state of that qubit. Or we might have perfect quantum control, but after we've written information into that qubit state, magnetic noise in the environment can lead to its decoherence, which degrades that information that we've written. And so if the second qubit acts as a source of noise, it may lead to decoherence of the quantum states we produce in the first. And obviously, since we have a suite of molecules, we can ask how do these influences depend on the nature and magnitude of these interactions between them. So we'll start with the question of quantum control. And one of the most essential ways to demonstrate arbitrary quantum control over a qubit is to demonstrate Rabi oscillations. And this is done by applying a microwave pulse, which drives our transition from our 1 state to our 0 state and back. And as we drive the spin from 1 to 0 and back, we then read out how much of the 1 state and 0 state we've mixed with a Hun echo sequence. And what we get out are these oscillations, which show that we can drive this 2-level quantum state into any arbitrary superposition of the 2. Moreover, the frequency of this oscillation is dependent on the spin state of the qubit that we're manipulating. And so really critically, when we compare the monometallic reference compounds to our bimetallics, we see that we have the same Rabi frequency, which tells us that even though we have 2 interacting spin centers, they are behaving as 2 s equals 1/2 qubits and not 1 s equals 1 qubit. But the Rabi oscillations are only looking at one part of the quantum states that we're producing. They're looking at how much 1 and 0 state we're mixing, or basically the latitude of this quantum state on our Bloch sphere. And so just like you wouldn't tell someone how to find your house with just your latitude, we want to describe these quantum states fully. We need to measure their longitude. And the way that we do this is with quantum tomography, where we actually measure the magnetization along all of the principal axes in space, allowing us to create a full description of that quantum state. Critically, we can do this under the same applied magnetic field to control for field-dependent effects and allow us to compare quantum states apples to apples, simply by choosing the microwave frequency that we're using. This allows us to construct the density matrix, rho, which contains all of the physically meaningful parameters that describe our quantum state. And we can compare that to the theoretical density matrix we should get after we do an operation. And we can see that sometimes we get very good agreement between the black outlines of theory and our colored bars representing experiment. And sometimes that agreement is not so good. We can quantify this agreement using a metric called the fidelity. And the fidelity isn't particularly good. And the fact that our single pulse operations that place our qubits onto one of the principal axes of our coordinate system versus our Hadamard gate, which is actually a composite operation, the fact that this, which requires more than 1 microwave pulse, is worse, tells us that it's probably instrumentation limits. We are really operating at the edge of our microwave bandwidth. Obviously, that could be improved by physical infrastructure, but we can use the fact that we have these monometallic analogs to extract the information that we actually care about. What is the impact of that second qubit? So instead of comparing it to an ideal quantum state, we can compare the quantum states we make in the bimetallics to the experimental quantum states we get in the monometallics to see just what the impact of the second qubit is and control for these instrumentational factors. And interestingly, what we see is that if you look at the pink and blue bars, they are by and large very good. The presence of the second qubit at these relatively strong interactions doesn't seem to impede our ability to control these qubits. But curiously, at the weakest interaction, we see a substantial degradation. in our fidelity. We believe that this is due to the fact that the time scale of the dipolar evolution of these quantum states due to the qubit-qubit interaction happens to coincide with the time scale of our experiment. So we understand now how a second qubit impedes or not our quantum control of the first. And so now we want to look at how does the quantum information that we write into those qubit states get affected by the presence of a second qubit. And again, this is an intramolecular phenomenon that we're trying to disentangle. And so we have to isolate it from the intermolecular interactions that could dominate. And one of the most dominant sources of magnetic noise is potentially the solvent, since we are doing these in frozen solutions. And so these intermolecular electron nuclear dipolar couplings we can reduce by replacing, for example, protons in the solvent with deuterium, which has a lower magnetic moment, or even better, by diluting that deuterated solvent with a nuclear spin-free co-solvent, carbon disulfide. And this can attenuate the interactions with the solvent enough that we should be able to see the intramolecular interactions dominate. But we still have to worry about the intermolecular electron-electron interactions. Since electron spins have a much bigger magnetic moment, their interactions persist over much longer distances. This, however, we can control with careful design for microwave pulses. And so the phenomenon that we're worried about here is called instantaneous diffusion, so-called because this decoherence occurs instantaneously by our refocusing pulse. The way this works is if you have two spins with the same control frequency that are interacting through space, if your refocusing pulse flips both of them, it does not refocus their interaction. However, if we reduce the number of microwave photons we put into the sample by using a weaker turning pulse, that allows us to flip only one of these two interacting spins, reversing the sign of their interaction and refocusing it, eliminating it as a source of decoherence. And if we extrapolate to infinitely weak pulses, shooting essentially a single microwave photon into our sample, we can extrapolate to what we would get in the single molecule experiment. This, as if we measure the phase memory time Tm as a function of our extrapolation, we can see a dramatic difference between our titanium and our copper as a function of the interqubit separation. This distinct asymmetry tells us that it's probably not an electron-electron interaction, which we would expect if the titanium affects the copper should affect the titanium. But we can understand this instead by looking at the nuclear spins on our molecules. And if we put the hydrogens back onto our crystal structures, which we often omit for clarity, we can sort of divide them into two groups. Some of them are so close to the spin centers that they lie within these pink spin diffusion barriers, where their interaction with the electron spin is so large that they really can't participate in their dominant nuclear spin flip-flop processes, which are the way they create magnetic noise. However, outside of this region, we have plenty of hydrogens left, predominantly on the copper porphyrin. And so it makes sense. Since the copper porphyrin is carrying its own source of noise, it doesn't really matter where we place the titanium. Its Tm is going to be the same. However, as we move those spins away from the titanium, we dramatically attenuate their influence and reduce the magnetic noise they create, improving the phase memory time. Also, really interestingly, if we compare the titanium only to the titanium copper complex, we see that even though we've taken this titanium complex and added a big source of potential magnetic noise, another electron spin, it actually decreases the amount of magnetic noise produced because it attenuates the influence of the nuclei, which end up being dominant. Cool. So what did we learn from this adventure in coordination chemistry? We showed that we can use coordination chemistry and inorganic design principles to create systems of multiple qubits, each of which we can control with a unique microwave frequency. And once we can do that, we can read and write information into either quantum state. And the presence of the second qubit doesn't substantially impact our ability to do so. Once we've written information into those qubit states, we actually find that the nuclear spins and not the other qubit's electron spin is the dominant source of decoherence. And finally, we can use the techniques of quantum tomography to map these quantum states that we produce much more in depth. And by doing so, learn about the quantum evolution of these states as a function of the interaction between our two qubits. So I want to thank a bunch of people, in particular the Friedman Group, especially Professor Friedman for her mentorship. I have learned so much more during my time in her lab than I ever thought possible. I also want to thank my collaborators, the Wasilewski Group and the Rondinelli Group, for their expertise in EPR and theory, my former lab mate, Dr. Chungjoy Yu, who is a 2021 AOB postdoc, for his expertise in scientific visualizations, the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation and the Department of Energy for funding, you for your kind attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.